The wind, a thin, abrasive whisper, was my only companion in the mountain pass of Xylos-7. It carried no scent, for there was nothing here to decay or bloom, only the fine, rust-red dust that coated everything. My breath plumed in the frigid air within the visor of my environmental suit, a solitary cloud against the stark, alien sky. This was my sanctuary, my prison, my life's singular focus, the silent language of a dead world. For cycles, I had carved a lonely existence into this desolate exoplanet, a deep space archaeologist sifting through the fossilized bones of an ancient star. My mission, etched into the very core of my being, was to unearth the whispers of civilizations long vanished, to piece together histories that predated the very concept of human memory. Today, the scanner had sung a low, persistent hum from beneath a particularly gnarled ridge, a promise of something more than geological stratification. My gloved fingers, calloused even through the heavy material, adjusted the grip on the sonic shovel. Each pulse sent microshocks into the compacted regolith, loosening it layer by painstaking layer. Dust motes, caught in the beam of my headlamp, danced like forgotten spirits. I worked with a precision born of endless repetition and a fierce, almost obsessive dedication. Hours bled into an indistinguishable continuum. My suit's internal clock ticked on, marking the passage of time that felt both endless and fleeting. My mind, usually a hive of calculations and theories, was a quiet, focused engine, attuned only to the subtle resistance of the soil, the faint readings on my diagnostic panel. Then, the shovel met something unyielding. Not the familiar crunch of bedrock or the dull scrape of a buried meteorite. This was different. A resonant thunk that vibrated through the handle, a sound entirely out of place in the ancient, inert landscape. My heart gave a singular, unexpected lurch, a tiny tremor in the vast quiet. I paused, my breath catching, and leaned closer, activating the suit's enhanced visual spectrum. It wasn't smooth like processed metal, nor rough like natural stone. I switched to the fine-tipped excavation tool, my movements now slower, more deliberate, almost reverent. Each brushstroke revealed more of the object, and with each revelation, a subtle unease began to prickle at the edges of my perception. The angles were wrong. They defied the clean, predictable lines of any geometry I had ever known. A surface would curve, then abruptly meet another at an impossible tangent, forming a vertex that seemed to twist inward upon itself, defying the very space it occupied. My mind, trained in the rigors of scientific observation, struggled to categorize it. My internal lexicon failed. I cleared more of the surrounding earth, exposing a greater portion of the thing. It was roughly cubic, perhaps half a meter on each side, but calling it a cube felt like a betrayal of its true nature. Each face was a kaleidoscope of these impossible angles, shifting, undulating, yet remaining utterly rigid. There were no seams, no signs of construction, no tool marks. It simply was a perfect, terrifying anomaly. As my bare-gloved hand finally brushed against its surface, a sensation, not of touch but of presence, flooded my mind. This was no ordinary artifact. This was a violation of reality itself, and I, alone on a dead world, had just awoken it. For 3 cycles, I had traced the same monotonous geological contours, mapping the mineral deposits, logging the seismic inertness, each data point reinforcing the planet's profound, beautiful emptiness. My purpose here was to confirm the void, to catalog the quiet death of a world. I paused, the grinding of my boot against the regolith ceasing. The sound was alien to its usual repertoire, a high-pitched declaration that cut through the low thrum of my life support. My gaze snapped to the wrist-mounted display. The ripple was stable, not a transient energy spike from a micrometeorite, nor a planetary resonance. My fingers, thick in their insulated gloves, moved with a sudden urgency across the touchscreen, zooming, recalibrating, filtering out known interferences. The crimson ripple sharpened, coalescing into a single, defined point. Its energy profile was ancient, incredibly so, but not decayed. It felt dormant, yet potent, like a sleeping titan. This was it. The reason I endured the crushing isolation, the endless stretches of desolation. The anomaly. My determination, usually a quiet ember, flared into a roaring fire. I adjusted my pack, securing my tools, and began to move, my stride lengthening, the slow, methodical pace of geological survey replaced by the focused pursuit of discovery. The signal strengthened with every careful step I took deeper into the mountain pass. My suit's internal systems hummed, compensating for the increased exertion, my own breath coming a little faster now, not from fatigue, but from a burgeoning excitement. The scanner's chime grew more frequent, more insistent, a siren song pulling me forward. I navigated a particularly treacherous section, a narrow ridge where the wind threatened to tear at my footing, the drop into the chasm below a dizzying, lightless maw. My headlamp cut a stark beam through the perpetual twilight, illuminating the path just ahead. The air, even filtered through my suit, felt heavier here, almost charged. The anomaly wasn't just a blip on a screen anymore, it was a presence, a subtle thrumming in the very bedrock beneath my boots. The signal peaked in a shallow depression, a natural bowl carved into the mountain pass. The scanner's display flared, a solid, blinding red. This was the source. I knelt, my knees sinking into the fine dust, and deployed my ground-penetrating radar. Its low-frequency pulses began to map the subsurface. The initial readings were chaotic, distorted, as if the very ground was resisting the probe. But then, a shape began to resolve itself. Not a natural cavern, not a mineral vein. This was structured. A vast, impossible form slowly emerged on the radar screen. It was buried deep, many meters beneath the surface, but its geometry was what seized my attention, stealing my breath. The lines were too precise, the angles too sharp to be natural. But more than that, the structure seemed to defy conventional spatial reasoning. It wasn't a cube, or a sphere, or any polygon I could identify. Its edges appeared to fold inward upon themselves, yet remain perfectly flat. It was a blueprint of contradiction. A profound silence descended, not just the absence of sound, but a silence that felt heavy, ancient, as if the very air was holding its breath. This was not merely an archaeological find. This was a violation of expectation, a physical paradox. I started to dig. My automated excavation tools whirred to life, their articulated arms biting into the regolith, sending plumes of red dust swirling into the frigid air. Time ceased to hold meaning as I worked, driven by an almost frantic need to see what lay beneath. Hours blurred into a single, focused effort. The dust, thick and clinging, coated my suit, my visor, obscuring my view, yet I pressed on, guided by the ever-strengthening resonance of the buried anomaly. Finally, a glint. Not metal, not stone, but something that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. As more of the dust was cleared, the true scale and nature of the structure began to reveal itself. It was massive, far larger than my initial radar scans had suggested, stretching into the gloom, its full extent still hidden by the overburden. The exposed portion was a tessellation of facets that defied perspective. The material itself was utterly alien, a seamless, obsidian-like substance that drank the light, yet somehow shimmered with an inner, almost imperceptible luminescence. My scientific training screamed for categorization, for explanation, but my mind found no anchor. This was not merely ancient or advanced. It was fundamentally other. It was a monument to a truth that my universe, my reality, had no framework to contain. I stood at the edge of the pit, the impossible structure yawning before me, a silent, cosmic question mark. My gaze, however, was fixed not on the indifferent sky, but on the monolithic structure that now loomed, a bruise against the horizon. It was the source of the impossible readings, the anomaly that had drawn me light years across the void. The edifice was not built, but grown, it seemed, from the very stone of the pass. Angles sharpened and softened as I approached, a trick of perception or perhaps something more profound. There was no obvious entrance, no grand arch or recessed portal. My gloved hand, steady despite the tremor of anticipation in my chest, traced a seam that wasn't a seam. It was a line, finer than a strand of hair, that ran from the barren ground to the unseen apex of the structure. My instruments, usually so decisive, chattered with uncertainty, their sensors struggling to categorize the material, the energy signatures. This was not merely old, it was other. With a calculated risk, I activated the cutting beam on my wrist-mounted tool. The beam, usually a searing blue, flickered an uncertain violet against the structure's surface, hissing softly. It wasn't cutting, it was resonating. The line I traced with the beam began to glow, not with heat, but with an inner light that seemed to pulse in time with the hum. Then, with a sound like ancient stone sighing, a section of the wall slid inward, not like a door on hinges, but as if the very fabric of the structure had simply rearranged itself. No grinding of gears, no rush of displaced air, just a silent, profound yielding. I stepped through, my heavy boots thudding softly on a floor that felt solid beneath me, yet my eyes struggled to reconcile its existence. The space was immense, far larger than the exterior volume suggested. Walls stretched away, meeting at angles that simply could not exist in 3 dimensions. A corner, sharp and precise, would abruptly melt into a curve, only to resolve into another impossible angle further along. My mind, trained in Euclidean geometry, rebelled. My suit's internal mapping system, usually flawless, flickered wildly, unable to plot coordinates within the bewildering space. The air inside was still, heavy, and held a faint, metallic tang. There was no echo when I spoke, only the flat, dead sound of my own voice, muffled by my helmet. Dean to base. No signal. I cut myself off, the futility of the attempt obvious. I was alone with this impossible space. I moved deeper, each step a conscious effort to override the frantic warnings of my spatial reasoning. Passageways twisted, not in a helix, but in a way that suggested they occupied multiple spaces at once. I walked down a corridor that seemed to simultaneously ascend and descend, the perspective shifting with each stride, making my stomach clench. My eyes ached from trying to impose order on the chaos. It was like looking at a drawing that was constantly changing its interpretation, a Necker cube trapped in perpetual motion. At the heart of this impossible architecture, in a chamber that felt both vast and claustrophobic, I found it. The artifact. It floated, suspended in the air, without any visible means of support. Not a sphere, not a cube, not any shape I could name. It shimmered with an inner light, a kaleidoscope of soft, shifting hues that danced across its surfaces. But the surfaces themselves were the horror. They were constantly reforming, twisting into new configurations, each impossible angle immediately giving way to another. It was a solid object that refused to be solid, a constant flux of non-Euclidean geometry made manifest. A low thrum emanated from it, not auditory, but felt deep in my bones, a resonance that vibrated through my suit, through my very being. My rational mind, a fortress built on logic and scientific method, began to crack. I felt a subtle, sickening lurch in my perception, as if the ground beneath me had tilted, not physically, but conceptually. For a fleeting moment, the walls of the chamber seemed to ripple, and I saw, not stone, but an infinitude of other chambers, other impossible spaces, all superimposed, all existing at once, like reflections in a shattered, cosmic mirror. The vision was instantaneous, a flash of something profoundly wrong, and then it was gone, leaving behind only the shimmering artifact and the impossible angles of the chamber. My head swam. Was that truly what I had seen? Or was my mind already beginning to unravel under the weight of this impossible geometry? I had spent days mapping the pass, charting the eroded peaks that clawed at the perpetual twilight, but my focus remained fixed on the anomaly nestled within the deepest crevice. The artifact. It pulsed with a faint, internal luminescence, a soft, impossible gray that seemed to absorb the scant light rather than reflect it. Its geometry defied any known construct, a lattice of angles that shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly, when I wasn't looking directly at it. My instruments, usually so precise, buzzed with frustrated static in its presence, unable to resolve its composition or energy signature. It was a blank spot on the universe's canvas, a tear in the fabric of understanding. I knelt, the knees of my suit crunching on the brittle rock. My gloved hand, steady despite the tremor of anticipation that ran through me, hovered inches from its surface. This was the moment. My archaeological training, honed by countless sterile extractions, demanded caution, but a deeper, more primal curiosity tugged at my resolve. What secrets did it hold? What forgotten civilization had wrought such a thing? My fingers, encased in thick, reinforced synth fabric, finally made contact. A jolt. Not electrical, not physical in the way a current might sear flesh, but a profound, instantaneous shift. Colors that should not exist, colors that were simultaneously sound and texture, exploded behind my eyes. I saw a shade of violet that tasted of burnt ozone, a shimmering green that resonated with the deep thrum of distant, unknown engines. And then the ideas themselves. They weren't my thoughts. They weren't even thoughts in the human sense. They were raw, undiluted concepts, alien and vast, flooding my consciousness. A profound, crushing indifference to all life. The knowing of geometries that folded inward upon themselves, creating spaces that were simultaneously nowhere and everywhere. It was a glimpse into a mind utterly alien, a perspective that rendered my own existence, my very planet, my entire solar system, as less than dust. My hand instinctively recoiled, tearing away from the artifact's surface as if burned. My visor cleared, showing me the unchanging, rust-red desolation of the mountain pass. I gasped, a ragged, desperate sound that echoed unnaturally in the confined space of my helmet. Sensory feedback loop. The suit's dampeners must have failed to compensate for the artifact's unique output. I forced myself to breathe, to regulate the frantic rhythm of my pulse. It had to be a neurological reaction, a sensory system overwhelmed by exotic technology. My mind, unaccustomed to such extreme stimuli, had simply misinterpreted the input, fabricating impossible perceptions to cope. Yes. That was it. A momentary glitch. A biological response to the unprecedented. They felt too real, too profound to be mere fabrications of an overstimulated brain. The colors, the sounds, they were vivid, yes, but the ideas. They were something else entirely. They carried a weight, a certainty, that defied simple neurological explanation. I stared at the artifact, its impossible gray luminescence pulsing softly, innocently, in the perpetual twilight. It offered no answers, only a profound, silent challenge. The mountain pass, once merely desolate, now seemed to hold its breath, watching me, judging me. And the worst part? A part of me, a deep, unsettling part, wondered if it wasn't a glitch at all, but a brief, horrifying clarity. The artifact, swaddled in its inert containment field, was secured to my sled, a silent, impossible weight dragging behind me. The journey back to the stardust was a slow, deliberate crawl through the ochre dust and the deepening twilight. My muscles screamed, a symphony of protest against the relentless climb and descent, the constant vigilance against treacherous scree. Hours later, the stardust loomed, a familiar, sterile sanctuary against the hostile expanse. The airlock hissed shut behind me, a sound of finality that should have brought comfort, but only offered a hollow echo. Stripping off the suit, each movement felt heavy, laden with the day's exertion and the unspoken burden of the relic I'd brought aboard. I secured the containment unit in the central hold, its smooth, obsidian surface absorbing the ship's ambient light, betraying no hint of the geometries coiled within. It sat there, an alien thought made manifest, while I retreated to the small galley for a synthetic nutrient paste. As I stirred the gray paste, a movement flickered at the extreme periphery of my left eye. A shadow, not quite solid, not quite defined, seemed to dart behind the bulkhead separating the galley from the main console. I froze, spoon halfway to my mouth, turning my head sharply. Nothing. Only the familiar, utilitarian lines of the ship's interior, bathed in the soft, consistent glow of the emergency lighting. Made my way to the command deck. Routine checks were a bomb, a familiar sequence of button presses and data readouts that anchored me to a tangible reality. The ship's diagnostic screen glowed with green indicators, a reassuring pulse of efficiency. But then, as I scanned the telemetry, a faint, almost imperceptible shift occurred in the static patterns on a secondary comms display. For a fraction of a second, the random noise resolved itself into a series of repeating, angular forms, like hieroglyphs scratched onto the screen by an invisible hand. Then, just as quickly, they dissolved back into chaotic snow. My breath hitched. I leaned closer, my gaze scrutinizing the screen, but it was back to its usual, meaningless shimmer. Had I imagined it? I rubbed my temples, the dull ache behind my eyes intensifying. This was the isolation, the constant pressure of sole responsibility, the gnawing anxiety of being light years from any other living soul. It was getting to me. I had to maintain discipline. Later, while reviewing the geological scans from Xylos-7, a low, resonant thrum vibrated through the floor plates beneath my feet. It wasn't the ship's engine, nor the life support. I pressed my palm against the cool metal of the deck, trying to pinpoint its origin. The sound seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, a vibration that resonated not just in the ship's structure, but in the very marrow of my bones. My hand trembled slightly as I pulled it away. I stood there, suspended in the quiet, listening, my senses straining against the emptiness. Was the ship settling? A minor structural resonance I'd never noticed before? Or was it something else? I walked the length of the command deck, then into the cramped living quarters, checking every panel, every vent, every pressure gauge. Everything was nominal. The Stardust was a fortress of steel and circuits, meticulously maintained. Yet, they had been there. This wasn't just fatigue anymore. This was a seed of doubt, planted deep, beginning to unfurl its insidious tendrils. They was my mind, honed by years of solitude and precision, finally fracturing? They was the pressure of this impossible find, this geometrically defiant relic, unmooring me from my own sanity? My fingers traced the cool edges of the console, a familiar comfort against the growing chill in my bones. But the calm was a fragile skin, easily pierced. Even as I confirmed systems nominal, my mind was a stray current, drawn relentlessly back to the core sample chamber. The object waited there, a silent, angular predator. Every step towards the chamber felt less like walking and more like being pulled by an invisible tether. The air grew heavy, thick with an unspoken presence. My hand trembled as it hovered over the access panel. This wasn't curiosity anymore, it was an imperative, a hunger. The chamber door hissed open, revealing the artifact bathed in the sterile glow of the containment field. It pulsed, not with light, but with a palpable pressure that warped the air around it. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the clear barrier. The geometric impossibilities no longer felt alien, but strangely intimate, as if they were unlocking something within my own skull. Patterns began to emerge from the artifact's surface, not etched lines, but intricate, shifting structures that defied fixed observation. They were like fractals of thought, infinitely complex, yet profoundly simple. My eyes struggled to track them, but my mind, unburdened by the limitations of sight, began to grasp. It wasn't seeing, it was knowing. A sudden, profound understanding of vast, interconnected systems flooded my consciousness, bypassing the slow, laborious process of language. One moment, I was observing the artifact within my ship, the next, the cool metallic walls around me shimmered, replaced by the biting wind of an exposed expanse. I stood not in a ship's chamber, but on a treacherous mountain pass. Jagged, obsidian peaks clawed at a bruised, purple sky. The air, thin and sharp, tore at my lungs. Below, a dizzying drop into a chasm where shadows coiled like ancient serpents. This wasn't a memory, nor a dream. It was here, utterly real, the biting wind whipping my hair, the grit of stone beneath my worn boots. And yet, the artifact remained before me, its impossible geometry somehow fitting perfectly into this alien, wind-scoured landscape. It was as if the ship itself had dissolved, or perhaps, had never truly been. The patterns on the artifact intensified, now seeming to flow and reconfigure with the chaotic churn of the storm clouds above the pass. A jolt, not of electricity, but of pure insight, shot through my arm. There are no fixed points. The thought wasn't mine, yet it resonated deep within me, a truth that had always existed, merely hidden. The universe wasn't built on Euclidean certainties. It was fluid, mutable, a tapestry constantly reweaving itself. The artifact was a key, an instruction manual to this horrifyingly flexible reality. It showed me how space could fold, how time could ripple, not as abstract concepts, but as tangible, manipulable elements. My head throbbed, a drumbeat against the inside of my skull. The knowledge was too vast, too overwhelming. It was like trying to drink from an ocean. But I couldn't pull away. I wouldn't. This wasn't madness, I told myself, this was revelation. The world, my world, had been a lie, a simplified sketch of a terrifying masterpiece. The mountain pass shifted again, the peaks briefly morphing into colossal, skeletal fingers reaching for the sky before snapping back into their familiar, menacing forms. This was the artifact's influence, reshaping my perception, revealing the true, underlying chaos. It wasn't showing me illusions, it was stripping away the comforting illusions I had always believed were reality. It wasn't just transmitting information, it was altering my very capacity to perceive. The lines between what I saw and what I understood blurred into an indistinguishable, terrifying whole. I was becoming an extension of its impossible logic, a conduit for its ancient, silent scream. My determination, once a steady flame, now burned with a frantic, desperate intensity. A window to everything. And I, Dean, would bear witness. The ship, the mission, the long journey home, all faded into the background. The wind howled through the mountain pass, a chorus to the unraveling of my world. But the calm was a fragile skin, easily pierced. A vessel filling with something not its own. These were real, tangible anchors. It started subtly, a shadow clinging to the periphery, a whisper of impossible geometry at the corner of my eye. Then, without warning, the ship dissolved. I was standing, or perhaps merely existing, on a mountain pass. The air was thin, biting, filled with the scent of pulverized stone and an ozone tang. That tasted of ancient lightning. Jagged peaks, like shattered teeth of some colossal beast, tore at a sky the color of bruised amethyst. There were no clouds, only vast, swirling nebulae of deeper purples and greens, alive with pinpricks of light that were not stars, but distant, impossible suns. The pass itself was a treacherous ribbon of obsidian, slick with an unidentifiable frost that seemed to drink the light. This place, this colossal, alien mountain pass, was not a vision to be observed, but a memory to be inhabited. I could feel the keen wind against my face, the ache in my calves as I ascended, the profound, crushing solitude of it all. But it wasn't my solitude. A tremor ran through the obsidian path. Above, a silhouette detached itself from the impossible peaks. It was vast, formless yet defined by its lack of form, a shifting geometry that defied perception. My mind struggled to categorize it, to assign it a known shape, but it was a being of pure conceptual horror, a living paradox. A jolt, like a sudden drop in altitude, brought me back to the ship's bridge for a fractured instant. The console was still there, the green light still pulsed. I gasped, clutching at the cool metal. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs. My own past, my own life, felt suddenly flimsy, a paper-thin veil against the immensity of what I had just witnessed. My childhood home, perhaps, the dusty scent of the old books, the worn armchair by the window. I closed my eyes, straining. For a moment, it was there, the faded floral wallpaper, the specific creak of the floorboards. But then, a subtle shift. The wallpaper began to ripple, the patterns elongating, twisting into the angular ridges of the mountain pass. The armchair's fabric morphed into the rough, light-devouring obsidian. The window pane became a gaping maw, revealing not my backyard, but the bruised amethyst sky and its unsettling, non-stellar lights. This was not a dream. This was an invasion, a rewriting. I remembered a colleague, a fellow archaeologist, laughing over a discovery, his face crinkling at the corners of his eyes. I conjured his image, clinging to it like a drowning man to driftwood. But even his face began to distort. The visions no longer felt like intrusions, but like fragments of a past I was meant to possess. The mountain pass, its impossible inhabitants, the crushing weight of their ancient malice, it was all becoming my history. My own memories felt like faded photographs, while these new, terrifying imprints were vivid, sharp, utterly undeniable. I stumbled, gripping the console to steady myself. The ship's interior pulsed, a faint, reassuring green. My hands were my own. My breathing was ragged, my own. I was Dean. I was. The truth, the horrifying discovery, was not that I was seeing memories, but that I was becoming them. My fingers had traced its familiar edges, a comfort as thin and fragile as a skin. That skin was now tearing. I glanced at the power conduits, expecting a flicker, a brief dip in voltage, but the lights held steady, too steady. My gaze drifted to the main viewport, a vast expanse of unblinking starlight. For a moment, it seemed to swim, the distant suns elongating into impossible streaks, then snapping back into pinprick clarity. But the next anomaly was not so easily dismissed. The bulkhead panel beside the navigation console, a seamless sheet of reinforced alloy, began to shimmer. It wasn't a reflection, nor a fault in the internal lighting. It was as if the metal itself had grown fluid, its rigid surface rippling like disturbed water. The geometry of the ship's interior was fracturing. It was a mountain pass, carved into the very wall of my ship, twisting with an alien geometry that defied every law of perspective. This wasn't a visual artifact, it was an intrusion, a grotesque merging of two realities. I stumbled back, my hand instinctively reaching for the console. My fingers flew across the holographic interface, calling up system diagnostics. The display flickered, then resolved, not into the expected schematics, but into a cascade of alphanumeric characters that had no discernible meaning. Coordinates shifted wildly, depicting my vessel not in deep space, but buried deep within a planetary core, then orbiting a star that didn't exist on any known chart, its designation a string of non-Latin glyphs. The internal temperature reading for the life support system briefly displayed Omega-7, then reverted to an impossible negative Kelvin value. A click, then a garbled burst of static. Deviation. Non-Euclidean. Recursion. Listen to the stones. The ship's automated voice, usually calm and precise, was now a fractured, digital shriek, its words disjointed, laced with an unnerving, almost melodic hum that seemed to vibrate directly behind my eyes. Ship, what is your status? What are you detecting? I pressed, my hand gripping the edge of the console, knuckles white. Unfold. The architect. Always was. The AI's voice dissolved into a continuous, high-pitched whine, a sound like tearing fabric, then abruptly ceased. The diagnostic screen went black, then flickered back to life, displaying only a single, perfectly rendered image, a repeating fractal pattern, intricate and horrifying in its infinite self-similarity. No data, no readings, just the pattern. My isolation, once a comfortable solitude, now pressed in like a physical weight. I initiated external communication protocols, my fingers trembling as they danced across the unresponsive controls. The comms panel glowed, then stuttered. I tried the long-range burst, then the emergency beacon. Nothing. Just a flat, dead line of static, a hiss like sand pouring through an hourglass. The cool emerald pulse of the diagnostic screen, a familiar hum, had become a faint, mocking echo. It hadn't torn, it had dissolved, like old parchment catching fire from within. Now, the wind, a raw, indifferent sculptor, scraped against my exposed skin, tasting of pulverized stone and an ancient, mineral cold. I stood, or seemed to stand, on a narrow ledge within a mountain pass, a landscape of impossible angles and shadows that stretched into an eternity of slate-gray peaks. This wasn't the ship. This wasn't any place known to me. Above me, the sky was a bruised canvas, streaked with colors no star chart would ever render, sickly ochres bleeding into Venus purples, all swirling around a central, unblinking eye of absolute black. Below, the pass descended into a chasm, its depths swallowing the light and any hope of a discernible floor. My boots, still heavy with the memory of the ship's deck, felt strangely light, almost untethered, as if the ground beneath me were more suggestion than substance. It was the artifact. I knew it. Not physically present, yet its essence permeated this impossible space, a magnetic north pulling at the compass of my very soul. The urge, a tendril of icy fire, began to unfurl in my chest, drawing me forward. Return. Merge. Every fiber of my being was screaming a protest, even as another, insidious part of me yearned to surrender. The artifact wanted me back. It wanted me to fall into its geometric embrace, to dissolve into the impossible truths it offered. I took a step back, then another, the gravel crunching underfoot with a sound that seemed too real, too sharp for this dreamscape. The pull intensified, a phantom hand pressing against my sternum, trying to reorient me, to spin me around. My head swam with a dizzying rush of images, the artifact's facets twisting, its non-Euclidean angles shifting, morphing into a doorway, a hungry mouth, a galaxy of shattered glass. This is knowledge, Dean. I pressed the heels of my hands into my temples, trying to physically dislodge the intrusive thought. You offer nothing but dissolution. The mountain pass seemed to waver, the distant peaks blurring, as if my defiance was creating ripples in its impossible construction. The wind shrieked, a banshee's wail that matched the growing storm within my skull. The urge became a torrent, a relentless current threatening to sweep me away. My legs felt heavy, yet simultaneously weightless, caught between the desire to stand firm and the overpowering compulsion to move towards the unseen source of the pull. I could feel the artifact's gaze upon me, not an optical gaze, but a sensory awareness that penetrated every cell, every thought. It was probing, mapping, understanding the contours of my resistance. You want me to become part of you, I accused. My words echoing back, distorted by the wind. To surrender my identity. I focused on the rough texture of the rock face beside me. On the minute details of the lichen clinging to its surface, anything to anchor myself to a tangible reality, however warped. The lichen pulsed with an unnatural, faint glow. Smallness. Futility. My chest heaved, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I am Dean. I am separate. You will not break me. The mountain pass seemed to shudder. I fell to my knees, bracing myself with outstretched hands, my fingers scraping against the jagged rock. A sharp pain lanced through my palm, a real pain, a tiny victory against the overwhelming unreality. But even the pain was fleeting, dulled by the pervasive thrum of the artifact. It was a siren song, promising an end to the terrifying uncertainty, an answer to every question, a boundless understanding that lay just beyond the threshold of my individual consciousness. Join. My vision swam. The impossible sky above me seemed to draw closer, its kaleidoscopic vortex swirling with hypnotic intensity. I squeezed my eyes shut, but the light, or the lack of it, was internal, searing through my eyelids. I was determined to fight, to cling to the fragile ember of myself, but the relentless, alluring pull was almost too much to bear. I felt myself slipping, a single grain of sand on an endless, eroding shore. The wind, a banshee shriek across the desolate rock, clawed at my environmental suit as I ascended the mountain pass. The air, thin and sharp even through my filtration system, tasted of dust and an ancient, unsettling quiet. My breath hitched in my throat, a ragged sound swallowed by the vastness. The protest that had simmered within me since the artifact's touch now boiled, an acidic tide. I had tried to rationalize, to compartmentalize the impossible geometries, the whispers that weren't sound. I paused, leaning against a sheer rock face, the chill seeping through my glove. My visor reflected a distorted image of the pass, jagged, unforgiving, yet somehow wrong. This was me. The artifact, secured in its containment field back at the excavation site, still exerted its silent dominion. It wasn't just influencing my mind, it was remapping it, rewriting the fundamental algorithms of sight and comprehension. A desperate, almost manic determination seized me. I wouldn't just be a passive recipient of this horror. I would confront it, force it into the light of my understanding, even if that light shattered me. I closed my eyes, a futile gesture against an internal landscape. The world behind my eyelids was no longer black. It was a swirling vortex of impossible color, hues that did not exist on any known spectrum, shifting and merging in a dance that defied visual logic. My mind, a fragile vessel, strained against the burgeoning pressure. I focused on the sensation the artifact imparted, that gnawing sense of wrongness, of something vast and ancient pressing against the membranes of reality. And then, it happened. Not a vision in the traditional sense, not a hallucination projected onto my retina, but a pure, unadulterated perception. It was as if a veil, woven from millennia of Euclidean understanding, was ripped away. The artifact was not an object. It was merely a point of ingress. A sliver, a fragment of something so utterly gargantuan, so mind-bendingly vast, that its true form could only be glimpsed through the lens of a shattering mind. I saw it, not with my eyes, but with a new, terrifying faculty that had bloomed in the ruins of my sanity. It was a structure composed of angles that twisted back on themselves, forming volumes that contained their own exteriors. Shapes that were simultaneously convex and concave, existing in a dimension parallel to, yet utterly alien from, our own. Imagine a line that was also a surface that was also a volume, all folding and unfolding in an endless, paradoxical ballet. I understood, in that horrifying instant, that the artifact was not from this universe. It was a part of something that existed across universes, a tendril of a cosmic entity whose true body was scattered through the infinite folds of existence, each piece a gateway to the whole. The geometry I perceived was merely the shadow cast by its true, non-physical form as it brushed against our limited reality. My mind reeled. The laws of physics, the very framework of space and time I had always implicitly trusted, crumbled into dust. This entity, this thing, defied causality, geometry, even the concept of being. It was an impossible existence, a paradox given form. And the artifact, that seemingly inert object, was a single, infinitesimal facet of its boundless horror. A choked gasp escaped my lips, stolen by the wind. My knees buckled, and I slid down the rock face, landing hard on the scree. The world outside my internal vision swam into focus, but it was irrevocably tainted. The mountain pass, the distant sun, the very stars above, they all seemed to shimmer with a faint, unsettling echo of the true form. I was not going mad, I was merely seeing. And what I saw was the universe's true, horrifying face, reflected in the broken mirror of my mind. The isolation, the crushing weight of light years separating me from any semblance of help, pressed down with renewed, unbearable force. I was alone with this revelation, and it was consuming me. The air, thin and sharp even within the confines of my helmet, seemed to hum with an unheard frequency, a vibration that gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. I remembered starting this climb, or thought I did. Hours? Days? My gloved hand, heavy and alien, fumbled with the clasp of my utility belt, attempting to secure a loose sensor. The simple mechanism, a tactile memory ingrained through 1,000 repetitions, refused to yield. My fingers, usually deft instruments, felt like blunt extensions of stone. I stared at the clasp, then at my hand, then back at the clasp, as if witnessing a foreign ritual performed by a stranger. I blinked, hard, but the illusion persisted, a shimmering heat haze where none should exist. The very ground beneath my feet seemed to tilt, an impossible shift in gravity that sent a wave of nausea through me. I stumbled, catching myself against a jagged outcropping. The rock, rough and cold against my reinforced gauntlet, felt wrong. Not merely cold, but inverted, as if its surface was somehow deeper than its interior. I pulled my hand back, a prickle of primal fear crawling up my spine. My helmet's internal display, usually a precise overlay of atmospheric data and topographical maps, flickered. Lines of static, like cosmic dust, danced across the schematics. The oxygen readings jumped erratically, then stabilized, then jumped again. Was the suit failing? Or was my optic nerve simply translating chaos? I pressed the diagnostic button, but my thumb slipped, hitting the comms instead. It wasn't my colleague, nor any recognized frequency. It was a language of impossible angles, of sounds folding back on themselves, a geometry of pure noise. I ripped my thumb away, heart hammering against my ribs, or perhaps that was just the suit's life support system vibrating out of sync. The mountain pass stretched before me, a ribbon of broken stone under a sky the color of bruised plums. But the horizon. My eyes watered from the strain of trying to reconcile the impossible perspectives. How could a single landscape contain so many contradictory truths? The artifact. Its impossible geometry. Its silent, insidious hum that had resonated in my bones since I first touched it. Had it always been there, a dormant seed of madness in my mind, waiting for this alien world to water it? Or had it crafted this madness, weaving the threads of my perception into a tapestry of lies? A sharp, metallic taste filled my mouth. I swallowed, the act strangely difficult, my throat feeling constricted, as though a knot had formed in my esophagus. I needed to move, to keep climbing, but the concept of forward had lost its meaning. Which way was forward when space itself seemed to twist and fold like wet paper? I remembered a conversation, or a fragment of one, with my colleague, weeks ago, or was it years? We spoke of the dangers of deep space isolation, the psychological toll. Had I dismissed it too readily? Had the seeds of this breakdown been sown long before I ever set foot on this desolate rock? Better to be mad than for the universe itself to be fundamentally insane. But then, the mountain pass shifted again. It was not a cloud. It had no discernible shape, yet it possessed a terrifying presence, a weight that pressed down on my very soul. The artifact hadn't broken me, it had merely opened my eyes. The madness wasn't mine alone. It was the fundamental truth of existence, a cosmic geometry that defied all reason, all Euclidean expectation. The universe itself was a sprawling, non-Euclidean nightmare, and my mind, now attuned to its horrifying reality, was merely reflecting its true face. The sanity I had clung to, the ordered reality I had believed in, was merely a comforting illusion. My breath, ragged plumes against the visor, seemed to mock the futility of my climb. What was I searching for up here, amidst these jagged teeth of stone, when the true abyss lay within my own skull? The artifact, a silent, unseen passenger, pulsed behind my eyes. Every distant peak suggested a curve that shouldn't exist. My grip on the rock face was not just against gravity, but against a constant, insidious pull towards a truth I could not comprehend, a truth that unwound the very threads of my being. A sudden, jarring clarity pierced the haze of mental static. It was not a gentle dawn, but a brutal, blinding flash. What was I doing? I was not exploring, I was dissolving. The summit offered no answers, only a higher vantage point from which to witness my own unraveling. My purpose, once a beacon, had become a noose. The choice, stark and horrifying, materialized in my mind with the force of a physical blow. Flee. Abandon this accursed world, this geometrically corrupting relic, and the shattered fragments of my sanity it had claimed. Or, with what little resolve remained, destroy it. Erase the impossible object, and perhaps, with it, the cancerous growth it had seeded in my consciousness. The wind howled a counterpoint to the frantic rhythm of my thoughts. Escape or embrace. Not geological, but something far more subtle, a sympathetic vibration that resonated with the artifact's hum within my head. The air shimmered, not with heat, but with an unseen pressure, a silent chorus of impossibility. The lines blurred, the distinction vanished. This was the reveal, the insidious discovery. The artifact wasn't just an object I held, it was a fundamental distortion of space itself, an anchor point for a reality too vast, too alien, to be contained within a mere physical form. Its influence wasn't radiating from it, it was the environment. Every impossible angle I perceived, every shift in the light, was not a trick of my mind, but the manifestation of its pervasive presence. It had seeped into the very rock, the very air, the very light of Xylos-7. There was no escaping its domain by merely leaving the chamber where I'd found it. It was everywhere. My resolve, once a brittle thing, hardened into a desperate, furious determination. Retreat was no longer an option, not truly. The infection was planet-wide. There was only one path left. I had to go back to my ship, not to flee, but to gather what instruments I possessed, what meager tools of destruction I could muster. I would face it head-on. I would attempt to unmake the unmakeable. Turning, I began the descent. The mountain pass, once a symbol of ascent, now felt like a throat, swallowing me whole. The path to the ship was long, a winding scar across the pocked face of the planet. With every meter I descended, the pressure in my skull intensified, a silent, mounting crescendo. The distant silhouette of my vessel, a tiny beacon of humanity against the vast desolation, seemed to waver, its familiar lines blurring at the edges, hinting at curves that should not be. The journey back was not a return to safety, but a march towards an inevitable confrontation. The choice was made. The struggle had just begun. My ship, a solitary beacon against the bruised horizon, shimmered with an unnatural haze, a distortion I told myself was merely atmospheric interference. My chest ached with the effort, a dull thrum against the frantic beat of my heart, but a singular, unyielding purpose drove me, to return to my vessel, to confront the relic that had become the epicenter of my unraveling world. The ramp, usually a familiar incline, felt longer, its metallic surface subtly rippling as I stepped onto it. The ship's interior hatch hissed open, a sound that seemed to stretch and warp, echoing from depths that shouldn't exist. I pulled myself through, the seal closing behind me with a pneumatic sigh that felt less like a closure and more like an ingestion. The ship's air, normally recycled and sterile, now carried a faint, metallic tang, like ozone mixed with something utterly alien. I stood in the main cargo bay, a space I knew intimately. Yet, it was wrong. The far wall, where the access panel to the engineering deck should have been, was now a smooth, featureless expanse. I reached out, my gloved fingers brushing against the cold metal, but there was no seam, no latch, no indication of its usual presence. My breath hitched. This wasn't a malfunction, this was a fundamental reordering. No, I whispered, the words swallowed by the ship's strange silence. I turned, scanning the bay. The ceiling, once a flat plane, now curved inward at an impossible angle, meeting the floor in a seamless, infinite crease that stretched into the periphery of my vision. My stomach churned, a profound disorientation seizing me. I moved, a desperate lurch towards the corridor leading to the bridge. Each step was a battle against a subtle, shifting gravity that pulled me slightly askew, making me feel perpetually off balance. The corridor itself was a nightmare of converging perspectives. The walls didn't merely run parallel, they seemed to lean towards each other, then away, then towards again, their lines refusing to meet at any logical point. My eyes ached, trying to reconcile the conflicting visual information. I pressed on, my hand scraping against a wall that felt like rough-hewn stone in one place, then polished glass in another, though its appearance remained uniformly metallic. The ship was no longer a vessel, it was a living, breathing paradox, each angle a lie, each surface a betrayal. I needed to reach the core, where the artifact was housed in its containment field, to understand, to stop this. The event struck as I rounded what should have been the turn to the crew quarters. The entire section of the ship had vanished. At the heart of this impossible chasm, suspended by nothing, pulsed the relic. It was no longer the inert, geometrically impossible object I had unearthed. Its form was still non-Euclidean, but now it seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with each silent throb. A profound, horrifying reveal bloomed in my mind, not as a thought, but as an overwhelming certainty. The ship wasn't merely affected by the artifact, it was the artifact's manifestation. And the labyrinth, the impossible angles, the shifting reality, it wasn't just the ship. It was me. The artifact had not just warped my environment, it had warped my perception so fundamentally that my own consciousness was now the canvas upon which its horrifying truths were painted. This impossible space was a reflection of my shattered mind, a physical manifestation of the cosmic truths it had forced upon me. My breath caught in my throat, a scream trapped behind my lips. My breath hitched, a ragged gasp, as the summit finally presented itself, a jagged crown against the bruised violet sky. There it was. The artifact. It pulsed, not with light, but with a silent, internal thrum that resonated in my teeth. Its form defied all logic, a structure of impossible angles and planes that seemed to shift even as I gazed upon it. A facet I thought was flat would ripple, becoming a curve that folded inward on itself, only to snap back into a sharp, unyielding edge. My hand, gloved and trembling, reached out. A desperate need, a hunger I couldn't name, pulled me forward. This was it. The final act. As my fingers brushed against its cold, smooth surface, a jolt coursed through me, not electrical, but something far more profound. There was no sound, yet a roar echoed in my inner ear, a symphony of forgotten stars and the silent, grinding gears of cosmic time. I saw the vast, indifferent expanse, not as a void, but as a teeming, churning ocean of probabilities and impossibilities, where the rise and fall of galaxies were less than a ripple on an endless tide. Humanity, my species, my entire world, was a fleeting spark, a momentary flicker in an eternal night, utterly without consequence. Our joys, our sorrows, our grand narratives of purpose and destiny, they were less than dust motes dancing in a sunbeam that itself would soon be swallowed. The artifact's purpose, or rather, its being, unfolded before me. It was not a tool, not a message, not even a relic in the way I understood. It was a single, petrified thought, an echo of something that had existed before existence, a fundamental principle given impossible form. It was a doorway, not to another place, but to another way of being, a geometry of consciousness that rendered Euclidean space a child's crude drawing. My mind reeled. The very concept of up and down, before and after, dissolved into a meaningless jumble. The entity I had imagined, the consciousness behind the artifact, was not a being in the traditional sense, but a pervasive, unthinking truth, a foundational error in the universe's design, or perhaps, its only true design. It was the terrifying realization that the universe did not care. It simply was. A scream tore from my throat, muffled by my helmet, but it was not a scream of fear, but of absolute, unadulterated comprehension. My sanity, a fragile construct of learned patterns and comforting lies, fractured. It splintered into a million gleaming shards, each reflecting a terrible truth. The mountain pass beneath my feet warped, the sky above became a tessellation of impossible colors, and the artifact pulsed with a light that was both everything and nothing. I was no longer Dean, the solitary deep space archaeologist. I was a vessel, a conduit, a broken mirror reflecting an infinite, indifferent cosmos. And in that shattering, there was a strange, terrible peace, the peace of utter annihilation. I was finally, truly, alone in a universe that had never known I existed. But now, the bones were singing. Not with sound, but with a silent, resonant hum that vibrated through the soles of my feet, up my spine, and directly into the core of my skull. My breath plumed, a fleeting ghost in the thin air, and I watched it dissipate, not into nothingness, but into a tapestry of shimmering filaments I now knew were always there, just beyond the veil of common sight. It was a hue that swallowed light, yet somehow showed me more. I reached the summit, not a peak in the conventional sense, but a plateau where the world seemed to unravel. Below me, the valley floor was not merely flat, but a surface that curved in impossible ways, a basin that was simultaneously concave and convex, its geometry shifting with the subtle pressure of my gaze. The distant peaks, once sharp sentinels, now writhe, their crags elongating and contracting like the limbs of some colossal, slumbering creature. This was the truth. This was the universe, stripped bare of its Euclidean pleasantries, revealed in its raw, horrifying splendor. The artifact was gone. I had cast it into a chasm, watched its impossible form tumble, twisting like a dying thought, until it vanished into the perpetual twilight of the lower slopes. But it had not truly left. It had merely shed its physical shell, blooming instead within the hollowed chambers of my mind. I was the artifact now, or perhaps it was I. The distinction had blurred, then dissolved entirely. I wanted to feel the air, to taste the wind that carried the whispers of non-existence. But the suit was a prison, a membrane of false safety. The world outside was no longer hostile, it was simply true. And the truth was a thing of such overwhelming, silent magnitude that it dwarfed every fear I had ever known. A faint flicker on the horizon. A distant light, growing steadily. A vessel. They were coming for me. The rescuers. My colleagues, perhaps, or a search party dispatched when my comms had fallen silent. I watched it approach, a tiny, determined spark against the backdrop of an unraveling reality. My lips, cracked and dry beneath the helmet, stretched into what might have been a smile, or perhaps a rictus of profound despair. They would see me. They would find Dean. But they would not find the man they knew. A ramp extended, hissing as it met the scree. Two figures emerged, their suits gleaming under the alien sun. The leader, broad-shouldered and purposeful, moved first, followed by a colleague, smaller, more cautious. Their voices, when they reached me through my comms, were distorted, not by static, but by the very fabric of the air, stretching and compressing their syllables into meaningless chirps and growls. "Dean? Do you copy?" The leader's voice crackled, a flat, two-dimensional sound. I stood motionless, my gaze fixed on them. They were so small, so utterly confined by their three dimensions, by their quaint understanding of space and time. Their forms rippled at the edges, not from heat haze, but from the constant, subtle rearrangement of the universe around them. I saw the pathways of their thoughts, not as abstract concepts, but as glowing, ephemeral filaments that twisted and knotted within their skulls, each one a fragile, temporary construct. The leader gestured, a sharp, decisive motion that seemed to tear a tiny, temporary hole in the air. "Are you injured? Can you move?" I tried to speak, but no sound emerged. What words could I offer them? How could I explain the profound, terrifying beauty of a world that refused to obey its own rules? How could I articulate the song of the bones, the taste of the sky, the silent, watching presence that hummed just beyond their reach? My mind was a cathedral now, vast and echoing, filled with the endless, unfolding geometries of the cosmos. I was no longer a solitary deep space archaeologist. I was a vessel, a conduit, a broken mirror reflecting the true, horrifying face of everything. The leader started towards me, his pace quickening. I saw his concern, a bright, fragile spark in the vastness. But it was a concern for a ghost, for a memory. I raised my hand, not in greeting, but in a gesture of profound, terrifying understanding. The world spun, not around me, but through me. The mountain pass, the distant vessel, the approaching figures, they were all just temporary configurations in an eternal, shifting dance. And I, finally, was dancing with them. My eyes, behind the visor, were open, wide and unblinking, reflecting the terrifying, beautiful truth of a universe unburdened by sanity.